Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning if you are further to the west from me, and welcome to this webinar from the Accountability Framework, which is the first in what's planned as a series of webinars that AFI is going to run, aimed at companies and other private sector colleagues to provide you with information about the accountability, what it is and how to use it. And this first one is really about giving you an overview of the accountability framework, how it's being applied, and how you can learn more and use it yourselves. So my name's Ruth Nussbaum. I'm a global director of ProForest, and ProForest is one of the steering group members of the AFI. We've been involved since the early days of the initiative. So it's really fantastic to be here, and thanks to Jeff and Adrian for inviting me to help moderate the webinar today. So the two main people that you will hear from today are, first of all, Jeff Mulder, who is the team lead for the AFI backbone team and has done, as some of you will know, a huge amount of work to turn this idea into something which is really building out to be such an important initiative for all of us. He's the director of global programs at Rainforest Alliance, and has led much of this work. And then with him is Adrian Stork, who is senior program manager for supply chain accountability at Rainforest Alliance, and is a senior member of the AFI backbone team, and will be helping Jeff today to bring you all more up to speed with what the AFI is doing. So just if we move on to the agenda for today. So there's really 4 sections for the day. The first is about the Accountability Framework Initiative, and Jeff will introduce it to all of us. And then more practical information on using the framework to drive progress. Then getting started with the framework, and finally a question and answers and discussion session. And it's really, we are really hoping that you will, as we go through, if you can start putting any questions you have into the Q&A section, and we'll capture those as we go along, and then, as many as possible, we'll be able to have a discussion at the end, so that I think will be really helpful to make sure that we're really sharing with you the information that you need to have. The webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording will be put on the AFI website. So anyone, if you think that it will be useful for anyone else, or if you want to go back and see any of it again, then it should be available very soon on the website. So I will hand over to Jeff to get started, and please, any questions that you have, put them into the Q&A. Jeff, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Ruth, for that introduction, and very good day to everyone on the webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin with an overview of the Accountability Framework Initiative, really explain who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And then we'll move on and spend a good portion of the time talking about the different ways that the Accountability Framework is being used to drive progress around issues of deforestation, conversion, and human rights in commodity supply chains. So when the AFI began about 4 years ago, it was really especially NGOs that were calling for what we refer to as ethical supply chains. These are agriculture and forestry supply chains that are protective of forests and other natural ecosystems, and also respect the human rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, and workers. But since those 4 years, since that time 4 years ago, a very interesting thing has happened, which is that now it's not only NGOs that are calling for this, but really a much larger chorus of other organizations, including investors who are asking the companies that they finance and invest in to address these issues and risks in their supply chains. Commodity buyers are calling for these issues to be addressed more seriously. For instance, this is coming through the Consumer Goods Forum and a number of different sectoral platforms on rubber, on coffee, on soybeans, and others. And of course, governments are also poised to take decisive action in making ethical supply chains the new norm. We see proposals around mandatory due diligence coming out of Europe and potentially the UK as well. So putting all these things together, it's clear that ethical supply chains are really no longer optional. They're a core part of how businesses need to respond to the environment within which they operate in terms of the marketplace and society expectations. So more tangibly, what does this mean for companies? What are they being asked to do? They're being asked to set stronger and wider reaching commitments and policies on these issues, addressing the full scope of their business. They're being asked to take more decisive and more effective implementation actions, and depending on the nature of the business, this might involve what they do on the ground in their production sites. It might involve how they manage their supply chains, how they screen new investments or financing. And they're also being asked to be more transparent in communicating where they source, what they're doing, and what sort of progress they're making in addressing these issues. And as companies are being asked to do all these things at the same time, we see other organizations stepping up to support in very important ways, whether that's through innovations in satellite-based monitoring technology or more effective systems for traceability and supply chain data sharing, or whether it's through the work of national and jurisdictional governments on the ground. So where are we as of 2020? I think it's fair to say that there are certain bright spots. We've made a certain amount of progress in the past decade, but there's still many important gaps. So if we look at commitments, almost 500 companies have made commitments around these issues, but on the other hand, about 50% of companies operating in forest risk supply chains have no commitment to address deforestation. Even those that do have commitments, about half of them are not providing any reporting against those commitments. So we're really, we don't know how they're doing. There's not transparency. We don't know if progress is being made. And of course, the impacts that we see on the ground reflect this limited progress. So tropical primary forest loss went up, not down. And we also see disturbing trends in human rights abuses in many parts of the world. And so with this slide, I'm sharing obviously the bigger picture, but there's also a dimension of this that implicates the individual businesses, the individual companies. If your company purchases commodities, there's a good chance that many of your suppliers might not have commitments, they might not have robust implementation systems, they might not be monitoring progress, they're unable to provide you with information about compliance. And that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for you to fulfill your commitments. So there's a micro picture here at the level of companies that's very important. The Accountability Framework Initiative was established to help address these challenges. It's an initiative to work collaboratively to accelerate progress and improve accountability for ethical supply chains in agriculture and forestry. And we do this in two different ways. First, there is the product that we offer that we published last June called the Accountability Framework, which provides a clear roadmap for achieving and monitoring ethical supply chains. This framework reflects the consensus of a wide set of civil society groups, as well as international norms and expectations of commodity buyers and investors. We really tried to consolidate all of those perspectives into this framework. And the second thing that we do, the second way that we meet this goal is through our coalition. And the AFI Coalition is a group of 22 environmental and human rights organizations that share the vision of commodity production coexisting with healthy forests and thriving communities. The coalition is here to support companies, policymakers, and others to apply the framework so together we can make faster progress and work in greater alignment. And just as an aside on this slide, I shared some of the artwork from our new website, which is forthcoming early next month. And I put it here really because even though ethical supply chains are very challenging, very difficult, very serious, there's also an important human side to this work. And the AFI is here to support companies and others to work more effectively together. And through these collaborations, through these human processes, we can make faster progress. So what is in the accountability framework? First of all, in terms of the issues that the framework speaks to, over on the left, you can see the framework covers issues around deforestation, conversion of other natural ecosystems, human rights, and producer and community livelihoods. So we don't address every single sustainability issue, but we address some of the most important ones. And this scope applies anywhere in the world where agriculture or forestry commodities are implicated in these issues. In terms of the topics addressed by the framework addresses every main aspect of what it takes for a company to establish ethical supply chains. And these are organized into 12 core principles that you can see on the screen here that are sort of grouped into 3 categories. So first, there's a set of principles around what it means to set strong and effective ethical supply chain goals. Core principles 1 through 3, addressing the content of commitments around forests and ecosystems, human rights, as well as the specification of commitments, addressing questions such as what should the cutoff date be for a deforestation-free commitment, or what is a good way to set targets and milestones. The next set of topics, and the largest set, is around how to do effective implementation. And of course, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is the key to success. And the framework addresses implementation at different levels, recognizing that different companies play different roles in this space. So there's a set of principles oriented more to companies that are purchasing commodities and managing supply chains. Core principles 4, 5, and 6 speak to company internal systems, supply chain risk assessment and traceability, as well as ways to manage supply chains for compliance, how to deal with many of the complexities around large diversified supply chains, indirect suppliers, and similar issues. A second set of elements in the framework addresses what actually happens on the ground. So for companies that own production or processing operations, or are maybe only one step removed from those, such as local traders, questions around responsible practice for land acquisition, land management, long-term protection of forest areas within producing sites, how companies should approach remedy and remediation in case there's been recent deforestation or human rights violations. And finally, how can companies collaborate more effectively in landscape and sectoral initiatives as a way to help meet their supply chain goals? Monitoring and verification is another critical element that is really relevant to all companies, and there's a section of the framework on that. And then finally, how do you demonstrate progress? How do you report transparently about what you're doing and what you're accomplishing? And this is the subject of core principle 12. So these are the topics addressed in the framework. Most of these topics would not be very surprising to anyone who's familiar with the space. But of course, very often the devil is in the details. And a main reason the framework was created is that people were getting tripped up on these details, or they were maybe reinventing the wheel rather than building on existing guidelines, experience, and good practice. So one of the main things the framework does with respect to these topics is unpack a lot of those key details. And so the way the framework is organized is we have a high-level resource called the Core Principles, which provides the content of each of these topics in a very concise form. And for those that do need the greater details, that are asking the difficult questions, working to design specific implementation mechanisms, be it a supplier code or a land development process, would consult the accountability framework operational guidance and definitions. So if you want to understand the considerations to think about when setting a cutoff date, you could consult the guidance document on cutoff dates. If you're looking for guidance on how to address a pre-existing land conflict on a site that your company owns, the operational guidance on respecting rights of Indigenous peoples would provide a lot more detail on that scenario. Just a final word on our coalition then, before I pass the word over to Adrian. The Accountability Framework Coalition is essential to who we are and what we do. And the coalition includes a couple of different groups. So our steering group is our governing body. It's also the set of NGOs whose consensus is reflected in the accountability framework. In addition to our current steering group members, there were a few other members that were part of the framework development process and whose consensus is reflected in the framework. Those groups include Greenpeace, Forest Peoples Program, Rights and Resources Initiative, and IMAFLORA. As of 2020, we've also expanded our coalition to include a new set of supporting partners. These are organizations that share the AFI's vision and are keen to help promote and support application of the framework to meet it. And these groups work in many different ways. Some of them are focused on reporting and accountability. Some provide direct support on the ground. Some offer advice to companies as service providers. And this recognizes the value of all these different methods and forms of support, and really underlines the spirit of collaboration that's at the center of the AFI. So with that introduction, I'd like to pass it over to Adrian, who can help us get to know the framework a little bit better by describing some of the ways it's being used.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to speak for a few minutes about some of the ways that we're seeing the framework being applied in practice. As Jeff has mentioned, this framework was launched in June of 2019. Prior to that, and throughout a period of global consultation on this, we saw many companies start to pick up on the guidance that our coalition was developing. And since the framework has been launched, many companies have used it to help to set or refresh policies, or to help inform some of their implementation systems and reporting as well. So the companies that we see using the framework are doing so because they see value across a number of different areas. The framework, as Jeff has articulated, helps to meet the expectations of what they're seeing in terms of their buyers, or the investors, or other stakeholders who are involved in their particular business. This provides, by providing a common set of expectations here in the framework, companies can then use the framework to follow and set their policies and ensure that they're meeting these broader expectations at a global level and in markets. It also helps companies to be able to manage their global supply chains under a common and harmonized approach. Many of the companies who are sourcing forest risk commodities are doing so across various geographical regions, and are sourcing a wide number of commodities themselves as well. This can be very tricky. Obviously, those of you who are doing this work know that very well. And of course, having a broader harmonized approach, which can inform policies across these different commodities within your business, is of great value. The framework as well, since this has been a consensus-based process that has been built by the coalition that formed the Accountability Framework Initiative, then the framework's guidance itself really represents this consensus from civil society, and also best practices and other resources that exist. As the steering group was developing the framework, of course, we built on all of the different resources that were out there, whether it was the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights when it came to our guidance on human rights and Indigenous peoples and local communities, or also building on the existing reporting platforms and existing expectations and experiences from the voluntary space, knowing that a lot of good work has been done over the past 10 years, even if we all still need to make further efforts to drive progress and meet our goals going forward. So by using the framework, companies can gather in one place this type of consensus that builds on both existing best practices from the voluntary space, as well as existing resources, and be confident that this guidance then guides them in the right direction. It also helps to clarify reporting requirements to credibly demonstrate progress. And we recognized and heard from companies as the initiative was launched and as we were developing the framework, that this was a particularly sticky point for them. And so we worked in the framework to provide guidance around reporting. And we've also worked, as Jeff has mentioned, with many of our supporting partners who are in the reporting space too, to use the framework's definitions and guidance to help align their methodologies, so that the companies now can use the framework to guide the development and setting up their own reporting requirements, and be assured then that these internal systems will match the expectations from the different reporting systems that are out there, CDP, GRI, and others that we're working with. And of course, last but not least, and very importantly, to get credit for good work as well. We do encourage companies to note that they are using the framework, to reference the framework's definitions anywhere they are featuring this in their policies. And we'll talk a little bit more towards the end of this webinar about how you can also be in touch with us on the Backbone team so that we can feature some of your good work as well on our website. And now I'd like to give a few examples, some tangible examples as well as to how different companies have been using the framework recently. McDonald's Corporation, which I'm sure probably all of you are very familiar with, is one who has used the framework throughout as they have been developing various policies, in particular their deforestation-free beef procurement policy. As McDonald's is a large global corporation, of course, sourcing commodities across different regions, they really saw value in the framework in providing this overall harmonized approach. They wanted to see the rules of the game set out so that they could then determine for themselves and in their own context the ways that their internal policies and implementation systems could be set so that they would comply with this global best practice that we provide in the framework. And so this consensus from civil society we provided in the framework helped McDonald's to do this as they align their global policies with more commodity-specific ones as well. It's helped them as well, as you can see here in the quote from Rachel Sherman, their Director of Global Sustainability. It's helped them understand how they can report transparently and to demonstrate to stakeholders that they're making efforts in their supply chain. And the framework has provided the definitions and guidance they needed to do this in a very clear and detailed way. Another example, of course, when we look at traders who are uniquely positioned within the supply chain, are communicating both to their own suppliers as well as trying to meet buyer expectations, we see them using the framework as well. And Bunge is a great example of this. So you can see here in the quote from Michel Santos, the Director of Global Sustainability for Bunge, the accountability framework has provided a common language for them to use, both when they are trying to meet buyer expectations, but also communicating directly to their suppliers. And so the guidance in the framework then is a resource for them to use as they're setting supplier codes and questionnaires and ensuring that they're speaking the same language to both suppliers and buyers, and it's providing this clarity that's a benefit to them. And then finally, we wanted to provide you as well with an example of an industry group who's using this. So while we see a lot of individual companies using the framework, industry groups are doing the same. One initial example of this is the Book Chain Project, which is led by Carnstone. And so Neil Everett, their director here, you can see his quote. He's seeing the AFI as helpful in terms of setting the bar for the level of accountability that NGOs and civil society expect from forest product companies. The Book Chain Project used the framework as they were making the case to their members to develop a more detailed assessment of paper mills and suppliers that they were using within this. And to also ensure then that they're gathering the correct type of information and making sure that they're complying with the directives that they're setting out collectively as an industry group. So these are a few examples. There are some more as well, including how the Consumer Goods Forum has been using the framework as they're doing some very innovative work moving forward here in 2020. And I'll pass it back over to Ruth to tell you a little bit more about that.
Great, thanks, Adrienne and Jeff. And so, yeah, as I see from the people who've joined the webinar, many of the consumer goods companies are here on the webinar. And Adrienne's talked about how some of the individual companies and groups of companies are using the framework, but an equally important angle, and I guess really part of the reason that Proforest was very interested from the beginning in being part of this, is how can we make sure that all of the big global initiatives, policies, guidelines, which are trying to address these issues around deforestation and human rights, that there is a good degree of alignment, and that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel. And that's been one of the things that I think for all of us has been really important. And with the CGF Forest Positive Coalition of Action, that being able to reference back to the AFI has been really important. It involves 17 different companies. It's a coalition which wants to be focused on action. And so being able to build on something which, as Jeff was sharing earlier, has already had a lot of input from a wide coalition of different organizations and provides a pretty strong level of detail is a fantastic starting point for the companies to be able to think about how can they align and work together more effectively on delivery. So it's been really important in the CGF, and it's also serving as a very important framework for many other guidelines and tools and initiatives that are shaping how companies approach responsible production and sourcing. And just moving on to the next slide, maybe. No, there's all of these things, and many of you will be living in this world where there's standards and guidelines, there's implementation systems, there's monitoring and reporting, there's all kinds of assessments, there's scorecards, responsible finance, which often relates to the work that people need to do with their own responsible sourcing and procurement. And so a really crucial question has been how to have this greater alignment and less noise so that we can all make faster progress. I think all of us, as we reach 2020, feel there has been progress, and we should recognize that, but there's still a long way to go. And the more we can align and make progress, the better. And so with the framework, all of these different things can be connected with this common global reference so that we're using the same definitions and core concepts, both for the cross-cutting issues like deforestation or respect for indigenous people's rights, but also for common good practices around things like monitoring, verification, reporting. And it's really helpful to have all of this detailed guidance that we can go back to. And for new initiatives which are just starting, and one example is the Global Platform on Sustainable Natural Rubber, it provides almost a ready-made set of guidelines that they can then build on so that they don't need to reinvent the wheel. So moving on again to the next slide, here's some of the initiatives, the aligned initiatives. And I mean, for me, I think this slide really emphasizes why it is so helpful to have this. There are so many things out there. I think certainly I've worked with almost all of these, and I'm guessing many of you on the call have too. And so making sure that we have this kind of alignment that means that if companies are working with any of these things, there will be similar definitions, similar understanding of what good looks like, similar tools which are being signposted that you can use. I think is really important, and it allows us, or is beginning to allow us, to be much more effective in actually moving from thinking about how to define things to making progress into actually implementing them in practice, which is where we all need to be if we're going to drive real change. And it's not only with all of these mainly voluntary initiatives, but also if we look at increasingly the way AFI is informing public policy development. So in importing countries, that the EU, as many of you, again, I'm sure are very aware, is looking at a due diligence process for deforestation commodities. The UK has had a study, the Global Resources Initiative, and the US looking at a deforestation bill, are all looking at AFI as a useful reference for all of these, to provide this framework. And in producing countries also, in various countries in Africa, Ghana, Liberia, Cameroon, in Colombia, in South America, in Indonesia. And I think there was this same webinar earlier today in Indonesia where the LTKL, who's one of the supporting partners and works on jurisdictional initiatives, joined the call, sharing their experience of why it's so useful to have this global framework that people can reference. And finally, is the science-based targets and AFI. And again, I think the science-based targets is very quickly gathering momentum. It's something that many of your companies will be involved in. And again, from the beginning, that there's been this connection, and that particularly for land use change, the targets on deforestation and conversion, explicitly signposting the accountability framework. So recognizing that the work has already been done to understand what we should be doing, and it doesn't need to be done again. So overall, I think what's really important, when the accountability framework began, there was this real sense that we needed a framework that everybody could use, that meant we weren't constantly having to reinvent and redefine, but we could align around things with broad support and use all of that work that we've done to be able to move forward into action. And I think that's where we are now arriving, which is really exciting to see. So Jeff, back over to you to talk a bit more about the practicalities.
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks very much. This is the final segment of the presentation. So if you're beginning to think of some questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll field them in a few moments here. Companies often ask us, say, okay, this sounds interesting, so what am I supposed to do? And I'd like to begin to answer that question here. And in one way, the answer to that question is, well, it depends what you're trying to do. It depends what your need is right now. The accountability framework is a far-reaching resource for ethical supply chains. As I spoke to earlier, it addresses every aspect of setting up an ethical supply chain, from assessing risk and setting a commitment through to implementation and reporting. So whatever part of that you're working on right now, there's a corresponding section of the framework that will help guide those activities. But let me also offer a more tangible answer about some ways that you can get started using the framework. And so there's three. The first is to begin by learning more about what's in the framework and about how others are using it. So of course, there's the framework itself. The core principles is the high-level document that you'd be able to read in a few minutes. And then the definitions and operational guidance provide the layers of detail underneath that. We're early next month, early October, so in just a week or two, we're about to relaunch our website. And when we do so, there'll be a lot of new content to really help facilitate the process of applying the framework. And one of the things that we heard from users is that they would appreciate having some concise summaries of the different topics in the framework. So we've now produced those, and the AFI's topical briefings provide short form introductions to the framework's content on, for instance, deforestation and conversion, human rights, traceability, monitoring, supply chain management, and so on. So you can really get the gist of what the framework has to say about these issues and the links in order to go to the next level of detail if you're ready to do that. We're also publishing a set of case studies so you can see how others are using the framework, and as Adrian alluded to, also extending an open invitation to any companies or industry groups that are applying the framework to let us know about that, and we'd be happy to highlight your work on the website, because it is really essential to get those real examples out there to enable peers to learn from one another about what they're doing, about what works, about how we move from principles to action. We're also publishing a section on the website about related initiatives. So if you have questions about how the accountability framework relates to certification, or how it relates to other implementation tools like the high conservation value approach, or to public policy, you can access that section of the site. We also, in addition to learning, also you might be ready to roll up your sleeves and begin applying the framework to analyze and make changes within your business. And to help do so, the AFI has also now published a set of user tools, and we expect to keep adding to this set of user tools in the coming months. If there's something that you'd like to see that you don't see, please let us know, and we'd be happy to hear and try to respond to that input. So one of the tools that is available right now is the self-assessment tool that allows you as a company to benchmark your existing commitments and policies, or your existing implementation and monitoring systems against the different elements of the framework in a sort of point-by-point way. So you can download this tool, and you can do this as an internal self-assessment. You can work with a service provider if you'd like to, in order to do that benchmarking, and as a first step toward identifying areas you may want to focus on. Another tool that we have recently published is a guide on how to write a strong ethical supply chain policy. A number of companies have said, hey, do you have a good sample policy that we could look at that adheres to all of the guidance in the framework? And we heard this question enough that we decided to write one, and it's available in this guide, along with a sort of step-by-step on how to analyze the context of your business and develop a policy that meets your business context, as well as the expectations of your business partners and your stakeholders. And then and again, keep an eye on our website as we release additional user tools to help apply the framework directly. The third opportunity that we offer is to engage directly. Sometimes it's helpful to talk to someone, to get advice, to actually have someone work through the particularities of your business, your organization. Many companies are working with a service provider or an NGO partner to help them apply the framework. Many members of our coalition are available to serve that role, and you're welcome to contact them directly. There's also other service providers that are not part of our coalition that may be interested in doing the same. And if you prefer, we also invite you to contact the AFI team directly if you just like some individualized support, navigating the framework, getting started. We'd be happy to have an initial conversation with you to explore that and try to set you in the right direction. All of these resources are available on our website, accountability-framework.org. If you go to the website, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and that's a great way to stay apprised of new resources, new tools, as well as updates on the initiative. And when we relaunch our website, which will be in a week or two, we'll be announcing that as well through our subscriber list. So at this point, I would like to close the presentation, and we have some time to answer your questions. So I think we have several questions that have come in already. I'll pass it over to Ruth to help guide us through this.
Great, thanks. And yeah, keep questions coming in. So, and some of them, no, if you have detailed questions, Adrian's been answering some where there's quicker answers, but I think there's already a few things that would be really good to get your feedback. So maybe starting with a question from James Griffiths to say, do you plan over time to develop an additional level of commodity specific guidance on ethical supply chains, for example, for soy or for rubber or for cocoa? So Jeff, maybe you want to talk about that.
Thanks. That's a great question, and I think it highlights the fact that with ethical supply chains, context always matters. So as a global initiative, the primary role of the AFI is to provide a consistent global framework that can be used by international businesses, but can also be contextualized in different places. Generally, our feeling is that groups that work directly in those sectors or in the places where additional guidance needs to be developed are best placed to develop those details. So for the most part, the AFI itself would not be developing additional sector-specific guidance. What we do is directly as the backbone team or through our coalition members, work with those groups that are developing contextualized guidance to try to see how it can be aligned with the framework so that from the get-go, there's that really tight linkage between what is the global marketplace asking for, how are we understanding and monitoring issues like deforestation and human rights, and how that plays out in a particular context. A great example of that, I think, is the work that we've been supporting over the past year, working with the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber. So that's a group comprised of rubber producers, tire manufacturers, automakers, as well as civil society, that's really developing a guideline and policy for the rubber sector. They own that policy, they're developing it, they're the ones that are going to implement it. That's a great structure. The accountability framework has provided a starting point that allowed them to shortcut a lot of discussions that might have taken a long, long time. So they were able to build on our global framework and accelerate their work and develop something that really worked for that sector.
Great, thanks. And maybe to say that with the work that Proforest is involved with the CGF, we are hoping the same for some of the commodity specific work to build on the AFI. So thanks, Jeff. Another question, or there's a couple of questions actually, which are really more detailed questions about implementation that I think it would be really interesting to get your thoughts on. So the first one, which is from an anonymous attendee, but it says, we're looking to adopt the AFI definition of deforestation to help with policy implementation. Are you comfortable with this type of picking and choosing as a starting point for incorporating AFI rather than wholesale incorporation of everything AFI encompasses? So no, starting to use pieces of AFI rather than necessarily committing immediately to using everything.
That's a great question. As highlighted earlier, there's so many dimensions to what it takes to achieve an ethical supply chain. The way companies and most organizations work is to take on pieces of that, to work on projects, to do a few things at a time, and change processes do take time. So we present the framework as a resource to help guide those change processes, which is to say that yes, companies are absolutely welcome to use the parts of it that are relevant to what they're doing at a particular moment. And the framework also speaks to companies of a wide variety of descriptions. So some of the guidance really has to do with companies that own and manage land, and not every company does that. So you'll find that parts of the material are more or less applicable to your business. In some cases, certain sections might not be applicable. We try to provide guidance on which ones are and which ones aren't. One additional thing I'll say, though, just to complete the picture, is that as a coalition, the members of AFI do advocate for the material in core principles 1 and 2 around deforestation, conversion, and human rights as sort of the normative expectation for what responsible practice looks like to be fully adopted by all companies, which is to say companies should be looking to eliminate deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuses in their supply chains. They should have commitments to do that. We very strongly encourage companies to, adopt that material, those norms, and then work as expeditiously as they can to meet those commitments.
Great, thanks, Jeff. That was really helpful and really clear. And perhaps to an extent, you answer another question already, but just to make it really clear. So from Julio, the question was, for a consumer goods company that purchases commodities and are further removed from on-the-ground operations, what's the guidance in regards to including points 8, 9, and 10? Are the companies in this tier more focusing on these 3 areas or mostly on 4, 5, and 6?
That's another great question, and I'm going to flip back to the overview of the framework so that people can see the core principles that are being referenced here. So if you're a consumer goods company or even a retailer that sits further downstream in the value chain, what is your responsibility to address issues around land acquisition, land management, and remedy, for instance? This is a question where, again, the devil is really in the details, and in the principles on those topics and in the guidance, we describe the responsibility of downstream companies to do that. But essentially, ultimately, it is the responsibility of those companies to ensure that the commodities that they're purchasing are not associated with deforestation or human rights violations on the ground. How to do that is a matter of the different mechanisms for supplier engagement. That could be in supplier codes of conduct, contracting processes, supplier engagement, plans for improvement in the case that there are challenges or non-compliances on the ground. One aspect that I'll mention in that regard is that we recognize that the role of consumer goods companies in being forces for good within producing regions is very valuable, and where companies have non-compliant suppliers, we encourage them as a general matter to engage with those suppliers to try to address the challenges in the ground rather than exclude them and buy from a clean source right away. In certain cases where non-compliances are persistent and the issues are not being addressed, of course, exclusion may be necessary, but this is a place, again, where there's quite a bit more detail in the guidance to really work through those nuanced issues that companies face as they take sourcing decisions.
Great, thanks, Jeff, again. And maybe now 2 questions which are quite kind of related to each other. So one is from Claudia Puente, who said it'd be great to hear about experiences where farmers implemented these guidelines. And no, what experience do we have of that, and particularly farmers perhaps rather than large producers? And another question which, Adrian, you already answered to some extent, but is to what extent do the guidelines apply to smaller companies? And I think, and it's a discussion we've sometimes had internally, is that some of the guidance is easy to absorb and to use if you are very large, but what's the growing experience now of how we can make this more accessible and more useful for the smaller, but no, vital smaller players in supply chains?
Yeah, those are both really great questions, and it's something that that we are working on, and especially with our regional coalition members in West and Central Africa and Southeast Asia and Colombia, et cetera. We are starting to work there with smaller companies to look at exactly that, how they can take the accountability frameworks guidance and apply it within their own operations, and how, of course, that lines up with the expectations that they're hearing from either traders or mills or buyers, et cetera. And the framework does include operational guidance around how companies do engage with smaller producers, smallholders specifically, in terms of how those smallholders then incorporate that guidance is something that we're practicing and learning in real time. And we're getting a lot of information on this from the experience that we're having directly with companies, but also with some of our coalition members working in jurisdictional approaches as well, including LTKL, in Indonesia, for example, and then also with other smaller company producers in West Africa as well, where they do have their own production, but are also sourcing from smallholders. And so they're looking for creative ways to help the smallholders also comply with the policies they've set in place and to meet the expectations that we've set out in the accountability framework. So as an answer is that we're learning this in real time, but it's something we're actively working on as a coalition. And certainly as we do learn, we'll be compiling that information together and sharing it more widely with stakeholders. So stay tuned for more on that in our website too coming up.
And I think just maybe to add to that I think it's tremendously helpful when many of you, even if you are yourselves with larger companies, will have smaller players in your supply chain. And so really sharing your own experiences of what is working, what isn't. What are the biggest barriers? Is it lack of resources? Is it lack of commitment? Is it, what can we do to engage this portion of the supply chain more effectively? I think it would be great to hear back from people over time as well. So a couple of questions now, which are again, I think are quite related. So Philip Rothrock has asked, how do each of you see corporate responsible supply chain activity intersecting with growing activities around carbon offsetting? And how might jurisdictional scale work play into that? And something that I think is quite related from James Griffiths again is know that we live in such a dynamic world. How will you keep AFI up to date and relevant, especially incorporating new science, public policies, market developments, changing sustainability priorities, and having lived for the last 20 years with carbon offsetting as coming and going throughout that I think it's one of the examples of things that change. So perhaps Jeff, you can start off on those two questions and where you see AFI linking to carbon.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. To commend this group for going straight to the hard questions and the most relevant questions. These are great, and I think they are quite linked. So in terms of keeping the AFI up to date, the first thing I want to say is that part of what companies were seeking and asking us for as we were getting this process started a couple of years ago was, can you provide some clarity? Can you provide some certainty? So can you clear away some of the noise that we are hearing around different definitions, different expectations, civil society groups saying slightly different things to us, and we're just confused about what we're supposed to do. So in that regard, we want to make sure that the accountability framework is a durable reference, that it's not changing overnight, that companies and others can rely on it as a foundation to make decisions. So that's something we're very committed to. And in that regard, the core principles are ones that we don't necessarily expect to change very much or very frequently, because these are they're really grounded in key international norms and in what our society needs to do to be more sustainable and more equitable. That being said, in terms of how to actually achieve these norms, the world is constantly innovating. We have new technologies, people are constantly trying out new forms of governance and new strategies. And as a resource for best practices around what works, the AFI does seek to be responsive to that so that it can continue to provide a resource for good practices around ethical supply chains. The way that we approach that is really by hearing from our users and understanding what areas in the frontier are most relevant and maybe the greatest sources of confusion or ambiguity, where if we could provide more clarity, that would really help. A couple of examples right now, I think the first one is around the relationship between supply chain initiatives and jurisdictional approaches. There's a lot of interest in that. The Consumer Goods Forum addresses jurisdictional approaches as a pillar of their Forest Positive Coalition of Action. And the AFI has guidance on that topic. A few of our coalition members, including ProForest and WWF, working with the Tropical Forest Alliance, have recently published a more detailed guidance document on that question. So that's great. Our coalition members have done that, and it's aligned with the framework. Another area where greater guidance seems to be needed is in how to better link up deforestation-free and conversion-free supply chains with greenhouse gas accounting. So in that vein, we've been working with the GHG protocol on making sure that those methodologies are linked up and that companies that want to track Scope 3 emissions as part of their overall greenhouse gas accounting can do that in tandem with the accountability framework. And they can figure out how to account for deforestation footprint or removal of footprint from their supply chain as they work with the GHG protocol. So, and again, you know, the feedback from users is always really important as we look to prioritize our efforts. So let us know what you'd like to see. In terms of carbon offsetting, that's a really great question, and I think that's a very dynamic space. The framework, I think, addresses that only in a pretty general way in terms of the different ways that companies downstream can provide support for upstream actors that might bring resources to support sustainability improvements on the ground. So that approach is quite consistent with the framework, but we would you know, encourage companies to look to other resources for the detail on the sort of how and what of implementing that.
Great, thanks, Jeff. One other question, which I think it would be good to get your thoughts on. So the question is from Martin Budsala, where he's asking, he's saying the USA has also had quite high numbers for forest loss over the last 3 years, but maybe it wasn't agricultural driven. But I think the wider question that comes out of that is the accountability framework applicable outside those areas that you talked about? So the sort of Southeast Asia, Central West Africa, and Latin America areas. Is it applicable elsewhere?
It's definitely applicable elsewhere. We see it as applicable anywhere where the topics that are addressed by the framework present material risks for social and environmental sustainability and in turn for business. So this is definitely not a matter of telling tropical countries what they need to do and having a double standard. These are really the things that everyone, that all of us need to do if we want to have a sustainable and equitable planet. One of the early uses of the framework was by a plantation pasture company based in Australia that was looking to establish deforestation-free livestock approach to respond to the needs of their buyers. So I think that's a good example of where a temperate country has applied it already. And other contexts such as grassland conversion in the United States are of concern to a lot of us. And we hope that the guidance will be useful there as well. Great.
So I can see we're coming towards the end of the time, but maybe one other quick question, because I think it will be quick for you to answer, from Anne Gillespie, who said, is there a kind of vetted set of white papers or research papers or LCAs or whatever on the AFI website? It would be great to have a definitive set of resources we can all reference. And you definitely have a set of resources, so maybe you want to just touch on that.
I mean, the accountability framework itself is really the definitive reference, and that comprises the core principles as well as about a dozen operational guidance documents. So those are the materials that the entire AFI steering group has signed off on a consensus basis. And there's a lot of analysis behind those and references and international norms and so forth that are footnoted in those documents. The other resources that I alluded to, like the self-assessment tool and the how to write a good policy, those materials are all derived from the framework, so that those are digests and syntheses of the framework that are presented in a more user-friendly way to companies and others. So that's how we, I mean, that's the sort of official set of materials that we offer.
Great. And the only final question that might just, and then I hand over to you to close, is just recognizing that you've already worked with CDP and with the science-based targets. Are you thinking of looking at or talking to other reporting platforms and business rating systems, the ones perhaps which have been more long established, like EcoVadis and SEDEX? Are you having conversations with them?
Yeah, we're engaging with many of the other reporting standards and platforms. The two listed there, we haven't had much engagement with. We're currently involved in a process for the Global Reporting Initiative, which of course is one of the most widely used reporting standards, and is developing a new standard on agriculture and fishing. So we're looking at how deforestation and conversion issues can be reflected in greater detail in the GRI standards, which are quite influential. Other organizations, reporting platforms that we've been engaging with include the Sustainability Consortium and some of the private systems as well. But I'm noting here the relevance of SEDEX and EcoVadis, and that we will certainly look into those in greater detail and see what we might do with them.
Great, thanks. So I think we've got through most of the questions. So Jeff, over to you perhaps to close things.
Yep, great. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to remind everyone this is the first webinar in a series in the company training and learning series. We have several more planned in the coming months. This was an overview. In the subsequent webinars, you can expect a greater level of detail on specific topics, including reporting, using the framework in tandem with certification and other tools. The next scheduled webinar is for October 21st and is focused on how your company can use the framework to help improve its sustainability ratings, which is of interest to many people. You can register for these webinars by visiting accountabilityframework.org/events. And on our website, you can also subscribe to our newsletter so that you don't miss any updates or events. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for spending this hour with us. And we look forward to interacting with you again in the near future. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.